Hello, 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 and welcome to Journey into the Prophetic. I am your host, Matt Gonzalez, and I am so excited that you joined us for this episode 7 with my good friend, Keith Ferrante. It is our heart's desire that we would create content that would help you to discover the best version of you in Christ. And on this show, I get to go on a journey with some of my great friends as we discover God's heart through the prophetic for the world around us, as we share our testimonies and stories of how the prophetic is transforming the world around us. Also, check out our new YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with the latest episodes of Journey into Prophetic. It's Matt and Des Gonzalez. Type that in YouTube and you'll find our channel. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, as this will help you to get the latest episode when it drops. Also, would you do us a favor? Would you share this on your social media platforms, as it helps broaden our audience? So I'm so excited. If you'd like to stay up to date also with our ministry, check out our website at www.matthewgonzalez.com. Now let's get into episode 7 with my good friend, Keith Ferrante. I'm stirred because I can't wait to talk about some of the questions and just kind of go on a little discovery and journey. And those who might be watching, those who may actually feel like they are called to be a prophet, but don't really know how that's developed and how they can get connected. And you're doing some amazing things right now. You have the emerging school of prophets, which is just taken off, and just hearing the testimonies of people who are being transformed by that, which is amazing. Yeah. So just for those who are watching, maybe it's their first time being exposed to Keith Ferrante and getting to know you. Tell us a little about what you do and who you are.
Keith Ferrante. I'm based out of the Mission here in Vacaville, which is now where Matt resides. So we're getting to have some fun together, getting to hang out a little more. And been here 10 years, been on staff, pastored a church for 10 years before that. So had a lot of pastoral ministry, but was trained by prophets for these last 20 years. The Lord brought people like Chris Valentin and Dan McCollum and Martin Scott and Don and Christine Potter and just a variety of prophets and apostles in our movement. And I've really enjoyed, probably about 4 years ago, Dano, I've been working on staff here, and Dano's like, Keith, it's really time for you to start building something that has your mark on it. You've served the house well. And and he felt like training prophets was really the best, encompassing of everything that I am. So at first I'm like, really, that doesn't sound, that exciting. And because no one really doing it that I know of. I mean, you have like your week-long schools, but we do like 9-month schools, and then we do online. We have online schools and a bunch of other stuff, and campuses and other places. So we started it 3 or 4 years ago, and it really is. I'm now like, wow, this is awesome, Lord. This is really your heart.
Come on.
And and it's almost like getting the revelation of why I was trained by prophets for so many years. Sometimes you're like, how, some people like, how did you get access to all those people? I wasn't looking for them, but I think it was God's blueprint, because it would give me some different impartations so the prophet in me is made up of a bunch of different prophets, good. And so it kind of creates we're each a unique prophet, but it's all the different fathers and mothers who have spoken in my life, and the Lord himself and all that stuff. But then it's like, so I've just enjoyed going on this journey. Now I just love training prophets, and that's what we're doing, and getting ready to launch a school for. Yes. If we can get it into people's hands. You want to run a home group or a school to train prophets? It'll be like blow by blow. Just here's how to do it.
So first question I'd like to ask all our guests: how did your journey into the prophetic start?
My journey, I grew up with a grandfather that was a prophet, kind of an old school style, people didn't repent, they died kind of prophet.
Yes.
But signs and wonders happen, and there was a lot of good stuff, Of course, that's not God, by the way. I learned when I met Chris Valentin, I had just prayed for someone, witnessed to them, told them they needed to serve the Lord. They didn't respond, they died the next day. And I wasn't like decreeing anything. Yeah. They just died in a car accident. And I'm like, that's validation that you're not. And then I met Chris, about early 2000 or 1999, somewhere like that. He's like, that's the wrong spirit. So, it's what Jesus told his disciples, when they were trying to call down fire, So I got on this journey into the prophetic. I had a grandfather, like I said, but I wasn't operating in the prophetic myself. I probably wouldn't say I'd ever really heard the voice of God for myself maybe one time. I spoke in tongues at a young age, 7 years old. I was fervent, witnessed, all that stuff, but I hadn't like, kind of like Samuel, you know, he's ministering in front of the ark at 12 years old, but didn't know the voice of God. I didn't know the voice. So it wasn't awakened until I got around the prophets. I mean, literally, you know, Chris Valentin was probably our first prophet, one of our first. I think there was Deborah Crone, Chris Valentin, and Wyndham McGowan, right, all within the same kind of months. And Chris, you know, he just put his hand on me, me and my wife in this cabin we were all staying in, and he just read our mail, and I'm like, oh my word. That was so cool. He was just talking about people in our church specifically, this person, that person, stuff in our life. And then I met Wendell, who's a fiery prophet who's been a father for like 20 years. And he's like, he was prophesying a bunch of stuff. He could say, you know, I was resistant. I'm like, I'm not so sure about this. But he could just go right through that. He blew on my stomach, you know. And that night I had my first angelic encounter. Literally in my bedroom, my wife and I in sleeping. There was a wind that started blowing in the room. And I woke up, sat up, and I started prophesying. And my wife wakes up, you're prophesying. And I went back to Wendell the next day. What happened? And, you know, he's, you know, interpreted. He became one of my mentors. So that kind of started it. I started going on this journey with prophets. I'd meet Chris every couple of months, go see him for 10 years. He did a lot of basically prophetic consulting, what I do now. I just kind of like, you know, we just met with them, and he'd be like, how are you doing, Keith? Oh, I'm great, winning people for Jesus. And then he'd go, oh, what about this? And he'd like go to something that I would never want to talk about. And he just started, that was that prophet going down to the root. And so the Lord started bringing these different kinds of prophets in.
I love it.
It was almost like I was just getting immersed in it, but I didn't really have prophet language. We were really a part of a non-prophet denomination. You know, you had a couple prophets, but they were never going to be anyone you knew. You know, and they were going to be scary, like David Wilkerson style, you know, like judgment coming. And we honor those guys for what they carried back there. But it's like God's shown us some things he's looking for today, you know.
So your first encounters, was it around a company of prophets, Deborah, Chris, and Wendell, which I know all of them, and that's good company. That is some great company. Wow. And so I'm just having some other questions I feel like we're going to go after, because I think it's going to be really, really good. So for those who may be watching, who maybe come from a church background, or maybe they don't understand what's a prophet, can you kind of lay a foundation? What is a prophet? How is someone called to be a prophet?
Well, I mean, I love doing that. My journey is really all about, in our schools, we just like, if you're strongly prophetic, you see stuff in the spirit, you prophesy, you may not know you're a prophet, you know, maybe you've thought you've heard from the Lord, or someone else told you where you're trying to figure it out. I'd like, just go on a journey with us, you know, because I think we have in our mind what a prophet is they're like a big time speaker, world renowned, Chris Valentin, Patricia King, James Gall, I mean, people in your, whatever, you know, maybe Mario Murillo, those kind of guys, prophet evangelists. And so it's like, we're like, well, I can never be one, or there's no one in the region like that. And so my whole thing is there's companies of prophets, and I believe it's, you know, it was the unknown prophet that was, you know, Elisha took and said, here's a word for Jehu the commander. And it wasn't Elijah, it wasn't Elisha that took out Jezebel. It was his unknown prophet that anointed Jehu, who finally ended the curse over the land. And so I have this whole thing. It's like we need to really embrace the emerging prophets. I have a book called Embracing the Emerging Prophets, and it's really about, there are a bunch of unknowns. They're known. I mean, he was unknown by Elisha, or he was known by Elisha. He was known by Jehu. Jehu knew generally, you know, that he's one of the prophet guys, you know, and I think that's important. We need to be known. I don't necessarily agree fully with the nameless, faceless. It's more like, we have a name, we have a face. We may not be famous in the eyes of the world, but we're known, we're healthy. We can have the word of the Lord put into our mouth and that's where I started going, we can train prophets, because Elisha could put into the mouth of this unknown prophet the word that he's supposed to give. He goes to Jehu the commander. He doesn't just give him what Elisha gives, he gives him more. You see that he expands on it. So I'm like, that's good. We started down this journey. And so I believe, like, some people think, well, a prophet is just like an inspired speaker. That's one definition in the Bible. I believe a prophet is someone that actually hears from God. You know, they have an encounter from God. In the new covenant, you know, Ephesians 4, they're there to equip the saints. What does that look like? They don't have to be a teacher. So we go through a whole thing of, if you're a prophet in the new covenant, which is, you know, Jesus died and rose again, we're now in this new covenant. So prophets have a different mandate than prophets from the Old Testament, from how they operated then. You know, so we go through this whole thing to kind of help people figure out, am I a prophet? How, you know, am I called? You know, there's a difference between calling and office. Being called is the start of the journey. Being in the office is when people and leaders and God says, boom, now you're ready for the place of influence I've called you to be in. Whether that influence is actually one person, because like Nathan was a prophet in the Old Testament, his metron or his assignment was King David. That was it. Then you got some preaching guys, but a lot of the guys in the Bible is like Elijah, Elisha, they didn't preach a sermon. So sometimes we're thinking prophets have got to preach sermons. It's like they were demonstration prophets.
That's good.
So just kind of, I think for me, it's like there's this grid we need to receive. It's like there's a lot of prophets. They may not fit into our public speaking view of it. They still are equipping people, but it may be more from their life, watching how they demonstrate, how they walk with God, the prophetic act of their life, the prophetic acts they do, you know, so.
It's interesting because even you step back, just you had shared encounter about Window and being around that group, a company of prophets, Deborah, Chris, and then Window. And so what's interesting is that you even see that biblically when Saul got around the prophets. There was an atmosphere that was created for an encounter. It's almost like that encounter happened because you were around these just prophets. And so it was like an entry point for you. And so I just think that's amazing, just thinking about that. So you were saying kind of how there's a difference between the call and actually, what was the language? Office. Office. So the call, would that be more of the emerging part? Would you say, is that kind of the emerging?
Well, like I would say it's like many are called, few are chosen. I use that analogy. I mean, God wants every one of us to get into the office, but there is a difference between the called and those that walk the journey to get healthy, to emerge, to be seen in that place of office. The office is your metron, which is the people you're called to reach, where it is. Maybe it's a nation, maybe it's the business world, maybe it's the church, wherever it is. Maybe it's an individual. Maybe it's behind the scenes to government leaders. Maybe it's, you know, whatever it is. Maybe, you know, just like we believe you can be a pastor of a church of 50, I think there can be prophets that have a small influence. Like it's like they're faithful with that, you know, that it's great. It's not small, but it's the metron may not be the nation or President Trump or whoever. It might be your local mayor.
That's good.
Which is where I started. I started with a town of 6,000 people. I wouldn't have called myself a prophet back then, but I had some other people starting to call me a prophet. That's the calling where you know you're in the calling. People are starting to call at you, but you're not, you know, like I'm like, when you're in the office, God sees you're healthy, your gifting is ready, and you have new covenant foundations that are really good. See, I have 3 grids that we really train our prophets in. What does health look like? It's kind of like Joseph. He's called at 17. He's got a dream. It's kind of more of a, it's more of a covert dream. It's not necessarily like I have called you to be a prophet, but he's like this dream. He knows he's got a leadership calling. He tells his brothers, we know the story. He goes down into the pit. So he needs to learn sensitivity. Then he's got to learn to resist Potiphar's wife. That's his second training. He's got to learn how to be faithful with the gift in the prison when he has restriction.
So good. And
then he gets to the palace, and the palace is the office place. He's now being welcomed into his main season of life of building what is inside of him, you know, through his administration gift, through his prophetic gift, his dream interpretation gift. So I'm like, the called place is 17 years old. The emerging is 17 to 30, getting healthy. And some people, it's like, they might be 17 to 50 and they never get there. Like, how come I'm not received? Well, you never figured out you got to get past the Potiphar's wife stage. You got to resist the enemy. You got to stay faithful to the Lord. You got to be faithful with your gift when you're in restriction, when you're in the prison, when you don't have all this freedom. You know, all these things are important. You got to learn to be sensitive. You can't be the Joseph like, hey, I'm the man of God. And you're wondering how come no one's receiving you. There's sensitivity issues. So that's the emerging part. And that's what I'm always going after with our emerging prophets. It's like, okay, you need to get healthy there. You need to get healthy there. If you get healthy, then you're going to accelerate your journey. It doesn't have to be 20 years. It can be 7 years. But if you don't understand it, you're like, I mean, I remember meeting someone at Bethel at the School of Prophets. They're like, hey, I've been going on this for 40 years. And I'm like, that's not a God issue. You're not perceiving where the growth is.
That's a good word. That's a good word.
So it's just like, that's why I do consulting. That's why I do schools. You know, I'm like, just find somebody that can help you point out, this is why I'm not getting hurt. You may have the good heart, you might have a good word, but maybe you're not sensitive. You don't know how to handle leaders. You don't know how to manage yourself. Them, you know, your gift will bring them before kings. But then what happens after they see your gift? Yep. You know,
I know even with my journey, I received the call from God when I was about 17 years old. But then I went through a 10-year journey. Yeah, I went through a 10-year journey. If it wasn't for Doug Addison, actually, Doug Addison had prophesied over me, and he had given me his prophetic word about the office and said, you know, hey, you just came through a 10-year journey of rejection. The Lord said you've passed the test.
Come on.
Now, so, you know, you go through those testings, and, you know, I had to overcome rejection. But even now, there's still more training and things you're overcoming. And so you're still growing your spiritual capacity.
Well, I think you can move into that place of office. It's like Samuel's word came to all Israel, and Israel recognized him as a prophet. Well, historians say that was 22 years between his 12-year-old encounter with the Lord and when his word came to all Israel. God let none of his words fall. So there was that training. So like there's 22 years there. Elisha served Elijah, some say about 7 years. Yeah. You know, and then you look historically, you know, through the Bible, anywhere between that, there's usually people are getting developed. They're not just moving right into the office where everyone's receiving them. And you know, for me, it has been about a 20-year journey. It's been like 1997 when it's like it became intentional. The prophets started coming to my life until, you know, I mean, the last few years, probably 4 or 5 years, people started recognizing me as a prophet in our house, in our church. But you're finding like 15, 20 years for me. And now I'm like, that's not really that long compared to, I'm 43. I still got a lot of time. I'm thankful because there's a lot of growth that I needed. And we need it. We want to get the growth well. We don't need to just feel like, oh, I got to go and I need to do another 10 years time. You don't have to do another 10 years time. If you can become intentional. That's why you're receiving, you know, receive from a Matt about the rejection he had to overcome. If you got rejection, because for all of us it could be different. You know, some it may not be as strongly about rejection, it may be more about fear, it might be, you know, who knows what the different ones are that we need to get. And God has it specifically for our training. You know, like Daniel, he's a prophet, but he's going into training on the language of the Chaldeans. And, you know, so his training is job skills and tact. He uses tact to speak to the, you know. And so, like, the training is different for everyone. The main thing is figure out what has God called you to? What are the prophetic words saying that you are as a prophet? You're like Jeremiah, you're a prophet to the nations. Well, that's going to give you specific focus to develop now.
That's so good.
You know.
I know. I was just even thinking you're talking, you know, my training was not only rejection, but was also overcoming fear of man. And part of it I'm learning now is because some of the words that I'm having to give, that I can't be afraid. I can't be like, I can't give this. You know, you have to be able to do that. You know, one of the things I love that you were saying too, and one of the things I like to teach is that, you know, the role of a prophet was always to enforce a covenant. And that's why you see different roles. Old Testament, you know, they're enforcing the law. New Testament, they're enforcing the message of reconciliation.
Come on.
So sometimes some of those people who, you know, are still kind of maybe stuck in the Old Testament office, there's that transition where you have to understand, like, hey, the enforcing's different. In the Old Testament, they had the law. We didn't have Jesus. We didn't have the work of Christ. We didn't have the message of reconciliation. We had examples of it, but it wasn't the fullness of it. And now we see in the New Testament, you know, the message of reconciliation. That's the covenant we enforce. And so prophets and prophecy looks way different. Yeah. So I love, because you guys, one of the things Keith is doing, they're laying this foundation in their prophet school of learning where the prophecy, because your foundation is going to determine your destiny. And we want to make sure we have the right foundation. So I love what they're doing. And we're going to give you some more information at the end of the show, how you can get connected to Keith and also the emerging prophets. So that actual word emerging has become a real now word right now. A lot of people talk about emerging prophets. I know you talked about it a little bit, but can you just give a real brief description? What is an emerging prophet? And then kind of how do you know if you're in that season of emerging.
Yeah, well, I think it is. I mean, for me, emerging is you're just coming forth. You're not, when you're in emerging, sometimes people don't know you're a prophet. Sometimes people don't.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean you're, even now, it's like not everyone, because you're a prophet somewhere, not everywhere. So it's like, there's still places.
Say that again. 'Cause that is good. You got it.
You're a prophet somewhere, not everywhere.
Yeah, that's good.
Because there's a metron. Paul says, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews.
Yep.
So there's a specific people group. It doesn't mean you can't cross over. It doesn't mean Paul's not ministering to the Jews. Most of the time when he's ministering to the Jews, though, he's getting his booty kicked. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm wondering, I'm like, was that him moving out of his metron? Yeah. I don't know. I'm just like, I think learning where is it God's assigned us to. But when we're emerging, we're not necessarily recognized. It's like, and God does it on purpose. It's like he keeps you in the hidden place, the secret place with him. He's developing you. Maybe there's little seasons where he sends you out and he develops your gift. So you get to, like, I've had like influencer season, like, prophesying over this general of this army, prophesying over whoever it is. You go there, but then it kind of lifts. And then, so you're like, hey, what happened to that? Because that's in the emerging season. It's like Joseph. He's developing his administrative gift, his dream interpretation gift, but he's developing his purity character, his sensitivity. So it's like in the emerging, these things are being developed, but they're not going to be, you're going to wonder how come the grace lifted in this or that, because he's teaching you this. Like for me, it was like, okay, signs and wonders. Now it kind of lifts. Now it's over in prophetic. That lifts worship. He's kind of moving you. He's training you in certain things he's developing in you. But when it gets here to the office, people start seeing, wow, like David. David was a prophet. David was king. He was called at 15, anointed. But then it's 15 years. I think it's like maybe 23 when Hebron, and Judah receive him. But it was 30 before Israel receives him. Yeah. So he's got like a 15-year journey, really, to, and he's emerging. So he's having to learn how to act like a king, act like a prophet when he has nobody else. When he's been running away, he's been hunted down. So he's having to wrestle with fear still. He's having to wrestle with fear. You know what? He takes out Goliath, side note. He takes out Goliath, but then he ends up living in Gath, which is where Goliath's hometown was, and actually begins to work for Goliath's commander, which was the king of Gath. So I'm like, he gets rid of fear in this big moment, but then because he gets afraid of Saul, he jumps over and is serving Goliath. So he's got that's the emerging of David. He's having to wrestle through fear. So when he becomes king, what's the first two things he has to do? He has 2 battles against the Philistines. He's got to get rid of that fear completely. Wow. And so they come back strong. And then it's like there's a solidifying of his kingship. So I think the emerging is like the development. People may not recognize you. David's already anointed king. He's got some people that recognize him, they're following him, but he does not have Israel, which is where he's called to be king. He was king, he was called to be prophet. What's the prophet side? I mean, prophet is he's just going to establish the tent of David. Yep. And that's the side that lasted for thousands of years. Good. Still talking about it in Acts, hey, we're going to restore the tent of David. So that was the prophet in him, but that had to be developed. So